English from Australia. Pelajaran nomor 59. Hello listeners. Hari ini kita akan meninjau kembali bagaimana cara mengatakan kembali apa yang diucapkan oleh seseorang. Kalau kita menceritakan kembali ucapan seseorang, kita menyampaikan apa yang telah dikatakan seseorang di masa lampau. Dan karena itu, kita harus mengubah kata kerjanya dari satu bentuk waktu ke bentuk yang lain. Mari kita kembali kepada suatu percakapan dalam salah satu pelajaran terdahulu. Apakah saudara masih ingat ketika Margaret Scott kembali dari luar kota? Ketika itu, dia sedang bercakap-cakap dengan Cecilia Rossi dan ia berkata,
"We've been very busy this week. We've moved some of our furniture, and I've cleaned some rooms. I've opened some of our boxes, and I've bought some new curtains."
Sekarang, Margaret akan mengulangi beberapa dari ucapannya tadi, dan Jane akan mengatakannya kembali. Coba dengarkan.
I have cleaned some rooms. I've cleaned some rooms.
She said she had cleaned some rooms. She said she'd cleaned some rooms.
Beberapa minggu yang lalu, Margaret berkata,
I have cleaned.
Dan sekarang Jane mengulangi ucapan itu.
She had cleaned.
Jadi kita ubah kata have menjadi had. Kita mundur ke masa yang lampau. Dan perhatikan bentuk singkat.
She'd cleaned. She'd cleaned.
Biasanya kata had disingkat dan digabungkan dengan kata ganti. She'd cleaned. Coba dengarkan Jane dan ulangilah.
I had eaten. I'd eaten. He had spoken. He'd spoken. She had come. She'd come.
Nah, sekarang giliran saudara berlatih mengubah tense. Coba ikuti dulu contoh berikut ini.
I've cleaned some rooms.
She said she'd cleaned some rooms.
Sekarang, coba saudara lakukan latihan berikut, dan pakailah singkatan kata had, she had, she'd. Kemudian, ulangilah jawaban yang betul sesudah Jane.
I've cleaned some rooms.
She said she'd cleaned some rooms.
I've opened some boxes.
She said she'd opened some boxes.
I've bought some new curtains.
She said she'd bought some new curtains.
Good, listeners. Tentu saja, kalau kita menceritakan kembali apa yang diucapkan seseorang, kata I dalam ucapan yang sesungguhnya biasanya berubah menjadi he atau she. Dan my berubah menjadi his atau her, tergantung pada apakah si pembicara itu pria atau wanita. Kata-kata ganti lain yang sering diubah ialah we dan our. Coba dengarkan.
We've moved our furniture.
She said they'd moved their furniture.
Coba dengarkan lagi apa yang dikatakan Margaret dan Jane, dan ulangilah apa yang diucapkan oleh Jane.
We've moved our furniture.
She said they'd moved their furniture.
We've been very busy.
She said they'd been very busy.
Baiklah, Saudara pendengar, inilah Chris, dan dia baru saja singgah untuk bertemu dengan Jane.
Hi, Jane.
Hello, Chris. What are you doing here?
I just dropped in to see you. I won't have time to visit you next week. I'm going back to uni then.
That's right. Well, I'll be glad to have a chat. Come outside.
What have you been doing this morning, Jane?
Oh, I haven't been doing anything. I've been a bit lazy. I haven't made the bed. I haven't washed up. I haven't cleaned the house.
What have you done?
I've applied for another job.
Oh? Where? Tell me about it.
Jane menceritakan kepada Chris tentang pekerjaan yang dilamarnya. Sesudah itu, Chris pulang untuk makan siang, dan dia menceritakan kembali kepada ibunya apa yang telah dikatakan oleh Jane.
And Jane said she hadn't made the bed, and she hadn't washed up, and she hadn't cleaned the house.
Really? What had she done?
She'd applied for another job.
Saudara pendengar, coba saudara latih beberapa dari contoh tadi. Saudara akan mendengar Jane mengatakan sesuatu, dan saudara harus mengatakannya kembali. Dan jangan lupa, ulangilah jawaban yang betul sesudah Chris. Siap?
I haven't made the bed.
She said she hadn't made the bed.
I haven't washed up.
She said she hadn't washed up.
Baiklah, saudara-saudara.
Hello?
Hello, Lucia.
Oh, hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm terrific. I've never felt better. You know, Lucia, I've been thinking.
Yes?
Do you know we've been going out together for 5 months?
Yes, I know.
And I've been thinking about you for 5 months. And I've been talking about you for 5 months.
Oh, Chris.
Yes, and I've been helping you with your English for 5 months. And I've been ringing you up for 5 months. And
What, Chris?
I've been teasing you for 5 months too, Lucia, haven't I?
Yes, that's right, you have, haven't you?
But what I rang up for was to tell...
Saudara pendengar, tadi Chris menggoda Lucia. Dan kemudian, Lucia menceritakan percakapannya dengan Chris kepada ibunya. Coba dengarkan. Pertama-tama, apa yang dikatakan oleh Chris?
We have been going out together for 5 months.
He said we had been going out together for 5 months.
Coba dengarkan lagi.
He said we had been going out together for 5 months.
Nah, sekarang Chris akan mengatakan sesuatu, dan Lucia akan menceritakannya kembali. Coba saudara ulangi apa yang diucapkan Lucia.
I've been thinking about you.
He said he'd been thinking about me.
I've been helping you with your English.
He said he'd been helping me with my English.
I've been teasing you.
He said he'd been teasing me.
Saudara pendengar, sekarang coba ceritakan kembali apa yang diucapkan Chris. Tetapi kali ini dia akan berbicara kepada Lucia. Jadi saudara harus mengubah beberapa kata ganti yang dipakainya. Coba ikuti dulu contoh berikut.
I've been thinking about you for 5 months.
He said he'd been thinking about her for 5 months.
Nah, sekarang giliran saudara untuk menceritakan kembali apa yang diucapkan Chris kepada Lucia. Dan ulangilah jawaban yang betul sesudah Jane.
I've been thinking about you for 5 months.
He said he'd been thinking about her for 5 months.
I've been helping you with your English for 5 months.
He said he'd been helping her with her English for 5 months.
I've been ringing you up for 5 months.
He said he'd been ringing her up for 5 months.
Baiklah, saudara-saudara. Saudara pendengar, sekarang kita lanjutkan latihan kita dalam menceritakan kembali ucapan seseorang. Kali ini, kita akan berlatih dengan tense yang berbeda. Coba dengarkan Margaret yang akan berbicara tentang Chris.
Chris was at Jane's place yesterday. He was in Indonesia last month. He was at home last night.
Dan sekarang, dengarkan bagaimana Lucia menceritakan kembali apa yang telah dikatakan oleh Margaret.
She said he had been at Jane's place. He'd been at Jane's place. She said he'd been at home. She said he'd been in Indonesia.
Margaret berkata,
He was...
dan Lucia mengatakannya kembali sebagai berikut.
He had been. He'd been.
Jadi, was dan were dalam ucapan yang sesungguhnya berubah menjadi had been. Mari kita berlatih tentang hal ini. Coba saudara ceritakan kembali apa yang akan dikatakan Margaret. Dan ulangilah jawaban yang betul sesudah Lucia.
He was at Jane's place yesterday.
She said he'd been at Jane's place yesterday.
They were in Indonesia last month.
She said they'd been in Indonesia last month.
He was at home 2 nights ago.
She said he'd been at home 2 nights ago.
Coba dengarkan lagi apa yang dikatakan oleh Margaret. Kali ini, dia akan berbicara tentang Chris dan Jane, dan Lucia akan menceritakannya kembali.
Chris dropped in to see Jane.
She said Chris had dropped in to see Jane. She said he'd dropped in to see Jane.
They chatted together.
She said they chatted together.
Margaret berkata,
Chris dropped in.
dan Lucia mengatakannya kembali,
He had dropped in. He'd dropped in.
jadi kita mengubah
Dropped in.
menjadi had dropped in bila kita menceritakannya kembali. Coba dengarkan sebuah contoh lagi tentang perubahan seperti itu.
Don worked in the garden for a couple of hours last Sunday.
She said Don had worked in the garden for a couple of hours last Sunday.
Dan berikut ini sebuah contoh lain lagi.
Jane applied for a job yesterday.
She said Jane had applied for a job yesterday.
Sekarang giliran saudara menceritakan kembali apa yang dikatakan oleh Margaret. Dan jangan lupa, ulangilah jawaban yang betul sesudah Lucia.
Chris dropped in to see Jane.
She said Chris had dropped in to see Jane.
They chatted together.
She said they chatted together.
Jane applied for a job yesterday.
She said Jane had applied for a job yesterday.
Baiklah, saudara pendengar, sekarang mari kita dengarkan percakapan lewat telepon antara Chris dan Lucia. Ya, mereka sedang bercakap-cakap lewat telepon lagi. Coba dengarkan.
What did you do last night, Lucia?
We visited the Italian club.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh, yes. I ate a lot and I drank a lot of lemonade. It was a very hot night. And we heard a good singer. And we saw some Italian dancing. We went home at midnight.
Can I come next time?
Nah, sekarang mari kita dengarkan bagaimana Chris menceritakan kembali kepada ibunya apa yang telah dikatakan oleh Lucia.
She said she had eaten a lot.
Lucia berkata,
I ate a lot.
tetapi Chris mengatakan kembali,
She had eaten a lot. She'd eaten a lot.
perubahannya masih sama. Tetapi berhati-hatilah dengan bunyi pada akhir kata kerjanya, yaitu bentuk past participle. Coba dengarkan.
Ate. Eaten.
Nah, sekarang coba saudara ceritakan kembali apa yang dikatakan Lucia, dan ulangilah jawaban yang betul sesudah Chris.
I ate a lot.
She said she'd eaten a lot.
I drank a lot of lemonade.
She said she'd drunk a lot of lemonade.
We heard a good singer.
She said they'd heard a good singer.
We saw some Italian dancing.
She said they'd seen some Italian dancing.
Saudara pendengar, sekarang mari kita berlatih dengan kalimat menyangkal. Bentuk waktunya kita ubah seperti tadi. Tetapi kita tambahkan kata not untuk membuat kalimat itu menyangkal. Coba dengarkan kalimat menyangkal yang akan diucapkan oleh Jane. Chris akan mengatakannya kembali.
Don didn't go to work on Monday.
She said Don hadn't gone to work on Monday.
He didn't feel well.
She said he hadn't felt well.
He didn't get up until 10 o'clock.
She said he hadn't got up until 10 o'clock.
Nah, sekarang coba saudara ceritakan kembali apa yang dikatakan oleh Jane. Dan kemudian ulangilah jawaban yang betul sesudah Chris.
Don didn't go to work on Monday.
She said Don hadn't gone to work on Monday.
He didn't feel well.
She said he hadn't felt well.
He didn't get up until 10 o'clock.
She said he hadn't got up until 10 o'clock.
Baiklah. Kata until artinya sampai dalam bahasa Indonesia. Saudara pendengar, apakah saudara masih ingat kata tell yang dipakai untuk mengulangi kembali ucapan seseorang? Kata itu kita pakai dalam salah satu pelajaran yang lalu untuk mengatakan kembali suatu perintah. Misalnya,
Sit down.
She told me to sit down.
Nah, kata tell juga sering digunakan untuk mengatakan kembali suatu kalimat yang bukan perintah. Coba dengarkan bagaimana Chris menceritakan kembali apa yang telah dikatakan oleh Jane. Dia akan memakai kata told, yaitu bentuk lampau kata tell.
I haven't made the bed.
She told me she hadn't made the bed.
Sesudah kata told, kita selalu harus mengatakan suatu kata ganti atau nama seseorang. Coba dengarkan Chris.
She told me. She told her. She told Mum. She told Lucia.
Sekarang, mari kita kembali pada percakapan antara Chris dan Jane yang terjadi pada permulaan pelajaran ini. Coba dengarkan apa yang dikatakan oleh Jane dan coba saudara ceritakan kembali. Saudara berperan sebagai Chris dan jawaban saudara harus mulai dengan she told me. Coba ikuti dulu contoh berikut.
I haven't made the bed.
She told me she hadn't made the bed.
Nah, sekarang coba saudara lakukan latihan berikut. Jangan lupa mengulangi jawaban yang betul sesudah Chris.
I haven't washed up.
She told me she hadn't washed up.
I haven't cleaned the house.
She told me she hadn't cleaned the house.
Baiklah. Kalau kita memakai kata say dalam menceritakan kembali apa yang dikatakan seseorang, kita tidak menggunakan kata ganti atau kata benda di belakangnya. Tetapi, kalau kita memakai kata tell, kita selalu harus menggunakan kata ganti atau kata benda di belakangnya. Coba dengarkan perbedaannya.
She said she hadn't cleaned the house. She told me she hadn't cleaned the house.
Sekarang, mari kita berlatih mengubah she said menjadi she told me. Coba dengarkan dulu contoh berikut yang diambil dari salah satu percakapan yang telah kita dengar tadi dalam pelajaran ini.
She said she'd opened some boxes.
She told me she'd opened some boxes.
Sekarang, coba saudara lakukan latihan berikut. Dan ulangilah jawaban yang betul sesudah Lucia.
She said she'd cleaned some rooms.
She told me she'd cleaned some rooms.
She said she'd bought some new curtains.
She told me she'd bought some new curtains.
Dan berikut ini latihan memakai kata-kata ganti lain di belakang kata tell. Coba dengarkan contoh berikut.
I drank a lot of lemonade, Chris.
She told him she'd drunk a lot of lemonade.
Sekarang, Jane akan menceritakan kembali apa yang telah dikatakan oleh seseorang. Coba saudara ulangi sesudah Jane.
We saw some Italian dancing, Chris.
She told him they'd seen some Italian dancing.
They chatted together, Lucia.
She told her they chatted together.
He didn't go to work last week, Jane.
She told me he hadn't gone to work last week.
Saudara pendengar, Chris baru saja pulang dari berkunjung ke rumah keluarga Rosie. Margaret Scott sedang membersihkan rumah dengan alat penghisap debu. Dalam bahasa Inggris, she's vacuuming the house.
Mom? Mom, where are you?
I'm here, in the lounge room.
Oh, do you want me to do the vacuuming?
No, I'll do it, thanks. What's the news from the Rossi family?
There's a lot of news. Guido's going to buy a shop.
What? What did you say?
I said Guido was going to buy a shop. He told me he wanted to buy a fruit shop. He said he'd have enough money soon.
That's interesting. Doesn't he like working for his brothers?
Oh, yes, he does. But he said he wanted his own shop. He said Paul could work in the shop with him.
What about Lucia? Will she work in the shop too?
What?
Will Lucia work in the shop too?
No, she won't. She told me she didn't want to work in a fruit shop all her life. She said she'd learned enough English to get a job in an office. Or she said she could study music.
Study what?
Music! Cecilia said Lucia had been learning the piano for 2 years. And Lucia said she really wanted to study at the conservatorium.
Perhaps one day she'll be a famous pianist.
What did you say?
Perhaps one day she'll be a famous pianist.
Mom, I can't hear you. Can I switch the vacuum cleaner off?
Yes, okay. I've nearly finished. Now, what other news is there?
Well, Mama told me she wanted to learn English. She said she'd already applied to the department and she'd been for an interview. She said she was lonely here because she couldn't speak English.
Good heavens! Did she tell you all that in English?
No, she didn't. She told Lucia in Italian, and then Lucia told me in English.
I see. We must all help Mama then.
Dan sekarang sudah saatnya bagi kami untuk minta diri. Tetapi jangan lupa membaca bagian kedua dari pelajaran tadi dalam buku saudara, dan pelajarilah bagian pertama dari pelajaran berikutnya. Goodbye, listeners.